The Drake Bulldogs went 10-1 in 1981. They were co-champions of the Missouri Valley Conference, and for the third consecutive year, they upset a Big 8 school. So what was their reward for a heck of a season?
No respect from anyone.
No respect indeed. There was no bowl bid forthcoming in 81 for the Bulldogs. A few months later, after the season concluded, they would just be kicked down to Division I AA, and eventually they'd find themselves playing D3 ball. 10 teams won 10 or more games in 1981 at the Division I level, and only 2 did not get a bowl invite. SMU was on probation for recruiting violations and weren't eligible to play in the postseason. Then there was Drake. Look, the 10-1 Bulldogs did not have a lot of signature victories that year, but they did beat Kansas State of the Big 8, although just about everyone was beating the Wildcats around this time. Despite recording the most wins in a single season in program history and having the best season at Drake since 1957, when those Bulldogs made it all the way to the Sun Bowl, these Bulldogs would have to spend winter in Des Moines, a fate that doesn't really get much sadder. A few years later, Iowa's other team would find themselves plying their trade in Division III. They did somehow get dragged back to the D1 level, though. Drake would be instrumental in helping launch the most unique FCS, or what was then Division I AA football conference, the Pioneer Football League. The non-athletic scholarship PFL exists in a fairly admirable bubble of D1 college athletics, allowing the likes of Butler, Davidson, San Diego, and others to keep football and their D1 status for other sports. Getting there, though, it required a 10-win season, a bowl snub, Iowa being unexpectedly good in qualifying for the Rose Bowl in 81, the NCAA being dicks as they are wont to do, and a whole bunch of other things. This is the story of the Drake.
Who's the Drake?
Who's the Drake?
The Drake is good.
That's Drake's ring ding.
Today it was press day for the 1981 Drake football squad.
Boy, I'm really starting to dislike the Drake.
Hate the Drake.
Throwing against the Drake defense is not the safest thing to do.
The best thing for a sweet tooth is a Drake's cream cup.
Say, Drake, I hate you like I'm young.
Got to love the Drake.
Drake football has a history, a rich history that isn't appreciated nearly enough. From Babe Ruth suiting up for the Bulldogs in a scrimmage during the 1920s to playing the first night game at Soldier Field against Oregon to the trailblazing Johnny Bright, who was a hell of a player and saw his Heisman candidacy derailed by some racist thuggery in Stillwater. The Johnny Bright incident would have a huge impact on college football during the 1950s. To learn more about that, well, you're going to want to head over to Wrong Sports, who has a great video on the entire ordeal. I'll link to that in the video description. In the aftermath of the incident, Drake would abandon the Missouri Valley Conference in protest. They spent nearly 20 years bouncing between the university and college divisions of college football. During this time, the Bulldogs did enjoy a few years of success under head coach Jack Wallace, including appearing in a couple of college division bowl games. Drake returned to the MVC during the early 1970s, but Wallace, for his part, slowly lost the plot and would be replaced by Chuck Shelton in the middle of the decade. There wasn't much joy in Shelton's first 3 seasons at the helm, but things changed in 1980 when Drake would finish 8-3, including an upset at Colorado. That would actually be the second consecutive year Drake would beat Colorado at Folsom Field. Heading into 1981, there weren't much in the way of expectations for Drake football because there never really was. That side, though, the 8-3 squad had lost several all-conference players, and they just looked as if they were going to have difficulty in keeping pace and matching what they had done the year previously. It should also be stressed, Drake was a distant third in terms of Iowa's 3 Division I college football teams at this time, even though Iowa and Iowa State weren't exactly world beaters. The school itself was also smaller than Northern Iowa, who were a new member of the Division I AA ranks. Since we are talking D1 and D1 AA, a quick note on this because there's a lot of confusion around this time. 1981 marks the last season as a D1 program for Drake. Now, you may have heard this change went into effect in 1978, and while that is when the NCAA announced that they were putting in qualifications for teams to reach the D1 threshold, things did not go into effect until after this 81 campaign. Don't worry though, we'll get into this a little more as the video progresses. The Bulldog season begins with a road game at the Unidome against Northern Iowa, and the Bulldogs get off to the worst possible start, falling behind 17-0. They do find their bearings in this road game and would emerge victorious 39-30. The following week sees Drake open Missouri Valley Conference play with a win over Indiana State, and they follow that up a week later with another victory, this time coming over Western Illinois. Also, before we proceed, I want to talk about the midfield logo that was painted in Drake Stadium for the 1981 season. It is seemingly painted to run parallel with the sidelines, which I just find to be super disorienting. Here's the deal. It's not like Drake was having games broadcast on TV. There wasn't a hard cam the logo should have faced, but I just can't recall a midfield logo being painted to run along the sidelines as this one is. Also, there aren't like in zone seats at Drake Stadium, so it's not for those fans to see. I don't really fully comprehend what is going on here with this midfield logo being oriented in this direction. Oddly placed midfield logo or not, the Drake Bulldogs were 3-0, but business was about to pick up. Drake headed to Manhattan, Kansas for a matchup against Kansas State. It was a scrappy, hard-fought contest that the Bulldogs would win. Quarterback Carl Yagowski tossed a touchdown pass with 34 seconds left in the fourth quarter to David Borsch. Look, was Kansas State good around this time? No, not really. But for Drake, this was a signature victory, and it also marked the third time in 3 years that they managed to beat a Big 8 school. Perhaps more importantly, a decidedly average K-State squad would get their first bowl bid in school history with a 6-4-1 record a year later. Keep that in mind when we get to the end of this season for the Drake Bulldogs. Anyway, the season continues, and the Bulldogs would win their next 3 games against the likes of Long Beach State, Wichita State, and West Texas State, moving to 7-0 on the year. The stage was set for an MVC showdown against Tulsa, who happened to be the last Missouri Valley Conference team to qualify for a bowl game when they reached the Independence Bowl in 1976. The game was even selected to be broadcast regionally, although Drake probably wished that wasn't the case. The Bulldogs ran into an absolute buzzsaw down in Oklahoma on this day. They trailed 35-0 at one point in the third quarter. The final score reads like a nightmare, 59-6. The thing is, Tulsa wasn't 50 points better than Drake, but the boys from Des Moines had an absolute terrible day at the office. A pregame rainstorm certainly didn't help matters for the Bulldogs on this day. However, it must be stressed, this is something that happens rather frequently in college football throughout history. Sometimes a team just doesn't show up. It's not necessarily a reflection of their season or quality, but merely a one-off and should be treated as such. To that extent, Drake has no troubles rebounding after the blowout. They go on the road again and pick up a victory against Southern Illinois before the next week going out and knocking off Illinois State. Despite being 9-1 at this point in the season, the writing is very much on the wall as far as a bowl snub was concerned. Sheldon is also out and about doing local media interviews, pretty much admitting that no bowl committee is interested in the Bulldogs. He hasn't heard from anyone. No bowl game seems to be interested in even just kicking the tires on potentially giving Drake an invite. Sadly, even in 1981, bowls had become more popularity contests than about showcasing the best teams in the country. Sheldon pretty much comes out and admits this when he said, if Drake had more fans willing to travel or a larger fan base, maybe bowl selection officials would have considered the school. The players were also out doing local media interviews, lamenting the fact they wouldn't be able to show the country just how good of a college football team they were, that they weren't going to be able to challenge themselves. Look, you don't win 10 games by accident. That just doesn't happen. Yeah, their schedule wasn't the most difficult, but you still have to win who you play, and not a lot of college football teams around this time got to double-digit wins. So you really feel for the players in not getting another game to show that just wasn't some fluke, that they weren't some patsies from the Missouri Valley Conference. Ultimately, this meant the team's final game of the season at home against the Nebraska-Omaha Moving Mavericks would be their bowl game of sorts. Drake on this day did not disappoint. They had no issues turning aside UNO, shutting them out 53-0, although it should be noted UNO is a Division II football program. It's hard to get like super excited saying, oh, Drake made a statement. What they did is they beat a D2 school. The MVP of Drake's historic 1981 season, it was actually kicker Henrik McMeyer. He would actually go on to be an orthopedic surgeon later on in life, and who says football players are just dummies? There was more to the Bulldogs than the kicking game. They got good performances from the likes of Mario Ware, who rushed for more than 1,300 yards and was an all-conference selection. Mike Williams was the team's leading receiver, and converted tight end Pat Dunsmore would go on to be drafted by the Chicago Bears. Sure, this Drake side wasn't a bunch of blue-chip recruits and high-end NFL draft picks, but it wasn't like they were a bunch of scrubs either, just beating on nobodies. None of that, though, was enough to convince a Bull to take a chance on them. Tulsa, though, probably gets screwed even harder the following season when they also finished 10-1, held wins over Oklahoma State, Kansas, and Air Force, and were left to go kick rocks at the season's end. Let's just take a look at some of the other teams that got into bowls in 1981 over Drake. Was Navy really more deserving than the Bulldogs? No, absolutely not. Many of their wins were just as soft as what Drake put out there. Of course, they were name brand and could sell tickets. That isn't what the postseason was supposed to be created for. It wasn't created to sell tickets or to make people money. It was a chance for the best teams in college football to face off against one another. We should also not lose sight of the fact the Big 8 was not very remarkable in 1981, yet that conference received 5 bowl invites. Oklahoma's bid in particular is especially egregious because they had absolutely no good wins. They defeated the likes of a 1-10 Oregon State, a not very good Colorado, and Kansas State, who Drake also beat. As annoying as the bowl snub was for Drake, the worst part of that 1981 season is the fact the Bulldogs' heroics get absolutely overshadowed by the revival of Iowa football. The Hawkeyes are having their best season in 20 or so years. Eventually, they end up in their first Rose Bowl game since 1958. Iowa just ends up gobbling up all of the headlines in the state. And had this happened another year for Drake, had they won 10 games, maybe even made the postseason, it would have received more attention. But because Iowa was so good after being so not so good for that long, it really stole Drake's thunder quite a bit on the football field. Ultimately, one of the best college football seasons the state of Iowa had ever seen ended with a dud and was consigned to be nothing more than a footnote instead of a building block to help Drake compete with the Cyclones and Hawkeyes. Not that they would be remaining at the D1 level for very long. A couple of months after their final game in the 1981 season, the NCAA drops a bombshell announcing 39 schools would be reclassified as Division I AA for 1982. A total of 5 Missouri Valley Conference schools, including Drake, was on this list of schools to receive the boot from D1. This is the culmination of a saga that actually begins way back in 1978 when the NCAA tried to force a bunch of teams down to D1 AA but could never figure out how to do it. There was always pushback. They couldn't move forward with getting these schools out of Division I. Eventually, though, due to a lot of pressure from the bigger schools of college football at this time, the NCAA just decides to make a unilateral decision, and that's why you get this announcement happening at the start of 1982. Some schools and conferences would opt to fight the decision, but Drake decided it was just going to go with the flow. Nothing would really change for the Bulldogs or the Missouri Valley Conference as a whole in the immediate aftermath of the decision because all of the schools had these long-term scheduling contracts in place. Most of them covered 5 years, some were for 6 years, but they were going to be obligated to play the other MVC schools regardless of what happened or what the NCAA decided. The only real difference for Drake is that they would now be eligible to qualify for the D1 AA playoffs instead of not being selected for a bowl, I guess. A potential playoff berth turned out to be irrelevant. Drake football declines immediately. There's a 1-10 season in 1983. That's a pretty bad low point. Murmurings on football's future at Drake grow louder and louder as the 80s progress. It had quieted down during 80 and 81 when the team was good, but all of a sudden everyone's wondering, what do we do with Drake football? Realistically speaking, the program had been losing money for years, and as costs to play were increasing, revenues were not. Drake is a small college in Des Moines that is the third or fourth most notable college football program the state has. It never was really able to capture the hearts and minds in locals outside of its diehard fan base. There were Bulldogs fans, but not enough to sustain the program, to allow it to at least break even. That was always sort of the stated goal of school administration. We just wanted to cover costs with football. We didn't need to make a bunch of money, but we didn't want to lose a bunch of money. This, by the way, is a discussion that predates 1980 and 81. Even in the late 70s, there was always talk, should Drake drop down to level? Should they just get rid of football entirely? Everyone seemed to have an opinion on what Drake should do with its football program. Come 1985, the school hand ends up getting a little forced. Its decision is more or less made for it. The Missouri Valley Conference announces that it's no longer going to sponsor football, and the teams that had remained were left to figure out their own futures. The remaining D1 schools, Tulsa and Wichita State, opt to go independent at that level. Others pursue life at Division I AA. Having been D1 AA for a few years and seeing that it was nothing more than a sustained money pit, Drake opted for a different path. Upon the conclusion of the 1985 season, it is announced that Drake will be dropping its football program down to the non-scholarship Division III ranks. Oh, by the way, as the Bulldogs are heading out the D1 AA door to the Division I door, they managed to still upset Iowa State in 1985. Big 8? More like big overrated. I thought that one was going to work a little better. Oh well. Drake originally decides that it wasn't going to play football in 1986 as the school prepared to drop down to Division III. The decision, though, is later reversed, and the Bulldogs play what it labels to be an exhibition season, whatever the hell that means. Only 3 players from the 1985 team would be on the 1986 exhibition roster. Drake head coach Chuck Shelton, who was a finalist for the Colorado job in 1981, opts to pursue a new opportunity in the Division I ranks. He would accept a job at Utah State upon the end of 1985. The Bulldogs start over at Division III, and it's all fine and well. No one really seems to enjoy it, but at least the football team's around. That, though, would change. The NCAA tells Division I schools with football programs outside of the FBS or FCS levels, what was it known as D1A or D1 AA, their football programs needed to be playing at that level beginning in 1993. This leads to a mad dash across the country as schools try to figure out just what exactly they're going to do. Some drop football entirely, some try to make it work at Division I AA with scholarships. Drake, and in particular then head coach Rob Ashe, looked to pursue a third path, playing non-athletic scholarship football at the D1 level. Originally, this was supposed to lead to the creation of the D1 AAA, D1 AAA, a body, a classification, I guess, that would feature Division I football playing schools that just would not offer athletic scholarships, as well as containing other smaller schools who maybe wanted to spend less money on football. It was never really clarified exactly what D1 AAA would consist of. And no one would ever find out because the proposal was rejected. With Drake and a handful of schools still committed to pursuing what they had called the Pioneer Football League, they had to slot it at D1 AA. They didn't have a choice. If they wanted to maintain their D1 status, they were going to have to be this group of non-athletic scholarship awarding programs at that level. 1993 comes and it's showtime for the Pioneer Football League. This was actually the 100-year anniversary of Drake football, and it felt like a rebirth of sorts for the program. No one really connected at the D3 level. It just wasn't really interesting or fun for all parties involved. More importantly, though, playing in the Pioneer Football League allowed Drake to avoid some of the pitfalls of the past. No athletic scholarships allowed the school to keep costs down while still providing financial aid to athletes as if they were any other student. It also made these schools more appealing to potential student athletes. One of the biggest challenges Drake faced is there were quite a few D3 schools in and around Iowa and the Midwest. There was nothing that really separated it from something like Coe College. Being D1 AA gave students who didn't get accepted into a D1 school another opportunity to play at a high level. All of that being said, almost none of the PFL schools jump headfirst in the D1 AA pool. Drake was scheduling a lot of D2 and D3 schools in those early years. I mean, really like a decade. they're still scheduling all of these lower level schools. The rationale here being they weren't making the playoffs regardless. They didn't want to get blown out. They wanted to be competitive, so they felt they would just schedule D3 and D2 schools while maintaining this D1AA status. From a competitive standpoint, I can kind of see the rationale behind it, but it's just not a good look when you have these 5, 6, 7, 8, however many schools the PFL had at any given moment playing the likes of D2 and D3 schools for all of their out-of-conference games. With the Division I AA, or what would become the FCS playoffs, not particularly a realistic end goal for programs in the Pioneer Football League, they decide to organize their own championship game between 2001 and 2005. Then the conference has this de facto bowl game with the Northeast Conference from 2006 to 2009. Throughout this entire decade, the oddies, the FCS playoffs, the D1AA playoffs are just continuing to ignore the Pioneer Football League. Some of that is, of course, schedule related. They're just not playing anyone. They're only playing each other. No one really thought this league was capable of competing at that level. Eventually, though, this changes. In the 2010s, the football playoffs are expanded to include more teams, and that means more automatic invites, with the Pioneer Football League finally included on the list of conferences who automatically qualified for the FCS playoffs. As far as this very story is concerned, well, 2023 brings us a full circle moment of sorts. Drake wins the Pioneer Football League in 2023, and with it, they are invited to the FCS playoffs. Nearly 40 years after being snubbed from the postseason in 1981, those Bulldogs finally get, it wasn't a bowl bid, but it was a chance to play on after the regular season concluded. The result was not great. The Bulldogs lost to North Dakota State 66-3, but hey, you got to start somewhere. Drake did return to the playoffs in 2024 and kept things closer against Tarleton State, but still fell in the first round. The million-dollar question here is just how a bowl appearance in 1981 would have impacted the trajectory of the Drake Bulldogs. Namely, do they get reclassified to Division I AA by the NCAA after that season with a bowl appearance in their portfolio? I think it's a difficult question to answer. On one hand, Drake did not meet the paid attendance requirements that the NCAA had stipulated for those schools wanting to remain D1. On the other hand, the governing body was basically making things up as they went along. The NCAA loses court battles to both Cincinnati and the MAC over their respective reclassifications. This was a winnable battle for Drake had they wanted to fight it. However, when you look ahead, when you gaze over the college football landscape around this time, especially after 1985, where was the future for Drake here at the D1 level? Sure, the school had a rich history, but the Missouri Valley Conference had dropped football after that year, and that seemed like an inevitability given the conference's odd hybrid status. New Mexico State leaving for the PCAA in 1983 certainly didn't help matters, but it wasn't like Drake being D1 was going to change things for the MVC. It was most likely doomed, and then what for Drake? They could have chose independence, I suppose. That's what Wichita State did after the 1985 season ended. Then, of course, went terribly. It was so bad the Shockers were like, nah, we're good on this college football thing, and dropped their program after one season as a college football independent. Drake was having similar financial issues to WSU. It's hard to imagine them not following the same path as the Shockers should they have been a D1 independent after 85. More importantly, as it relates to the story, Drake's bowl snub definitely led to them being shuttled down to the D1 AA ranks. The school is unable to find a way to stop losing money at this time. Even though these scholarship requirements were less, it just wasn't a financially viable proposition. Drake opts to give up scholarship football and instead goes the D3 route. Of course, the plan was quickly upended when the NCAA moved the goalpost again and forced D1 athletic programs to have D1 football teams, whether that was D1A or D1 AA. Drake wanting to maintain its status as a Division I program for its basketball teams, but also wanting to keep football around, appreciating the sport's history on campus, pursued what would become the Pioneer Football League. This allowed like-minded schools to compete against other non-athletic scholarship sides, even if it took them more than a decade to have the confidence to schedule other D1 AA schools. Realistically speaking, the first 10, 12, 14 years of the Pioneer Football League are barely division. It's 1AA in name only because many of them were just playing D2, D3 programs. That, of course, is still better than the alternative. The easy route for Drake and all of the Pioneer Football League schools who wanted to be D1 in other sports would have been to simply drop football. That is the decision several universities in similar situations had made over the years. Drake pursued a solution to its problem and were able to keep a tradition dating all the way back to the 1890s alive without placing the school in harm's way, without subsidizing football, which had become a money loser. It was a money loser in the late 70s. It was a money loser in the 80s. It would have been a money loser at D1AA in the 90s and 2000s and even to this day. Non-athletic scholarship, that is an option that ensured it could maintain itself on the campus. Maybe Drake never wins an FCS championship. Maybe they never win an FCS playoff game. And yes, they were absolutely screwed out of a bowl bid in 1981. Make no mistake about that. Yet sometimes in life you have to appreciate what you have, not what could have been. For Drake, having a football program today, well, the trade-off is probably worth watching the stupid Big Eights and 5 mediocre teams bowling ahead of them during the 1981 season. Thank you for watching this video. To learn more about Big West football, or also known as the Pacific Coast Athletic Association football, check out the video in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. And for the story of college football coaching's largest enigma, larger-than-life personality, that's going to be the video in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Until next time, I am Cheyenne Hollis. This is the Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it up the 25.